All right, well, so our plan for this evening is we have two more lessons to finish up Mark's book. And this evening, my plan is to get through all of chapter 14, which is fairly lengthy, and then to go ahead and begin chapter 15. So with that, we'll kind of jump on into it. You'll see here from our outline, we're going to be covering events such as the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, Jesus' arrest, and his trials. But we're going to begin in verse 1 in chapter 14 in Bethany, where Jesus has a gathering with some of his disciples and his followers and some friends. And in typical Mark fashion, the way he has told stories throughout his gospel account, this story is also given to us in somewhat of a sandwich form, where we sort of have events that are happening in the background. And within these two background events, we have a story that Mark wants us to focus on. But first, before we get there, what's going on in the background, we learn from verse 1. It says, "It was now 2 days before Passover, and the feast of the unleavened bread, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him. For they said, 'Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people.'" All right, so Mark orients us here. We're just 2 days before the Passover. Mark is the shortest of the gospel accounts, but it's also sort of the most direct, action-packed. And here in these last few chapters, we're going to get a very dense, sort of action-packed story that's going to move quickly just over a period of days in the final few days of Jesus' time before his crucifixion. And so things are going to start to move very rapidly as we progress through this chapter. But here it says we're 2 days before Passover, and here's the problem. Here's the problem lurking in the background. The chief priests and the scribes are looking to arrest him. It says they need to arrest him by stealth because they fear a riot from the people. Part of their problem, I think, is with Jerusalem itself. Jerusalem is a very crowded and compact city. Never been there, but I understand even today it's that way. But back then, it's a walled city. Everything's very dense, packed in together. And at the time of Passover, there's a lot more people there too. And so getting an opportunity to arrest Jesus away from the sight of others, away from the crowds, would be quite difficult. So they're looking for a way to find him, it says, by stealth. And then we get into our chapter here this evening. So now we're told a story about this gathering in Bethany. So Jesus has gathered in Bethany. In this account, it's told that it's at the house of Simon the leper. And we'll just read this, and then we'll discuss it here for a few minutes. Starting in verse 3, it says, "And while he was at Bethany, in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. And there were some who said to themselves indignantly, 'Why was this ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor.' And they scolded her. But Jesus said, 'Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you will always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her.' And then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. And he sought an opportunity to betray him." All right, so what's happening here then? Jesus has gathered with his friends in Bethany. Bethany is a short distance just to the east of Jerusalem, easily walking distance. But in Jesus' fashion, as he was in Jerusalem, they would go back to Bethany to stay the night. And so that's where they are. He's gathered with friends. All four of the gospel accounts record the story of a woman who anoints Jesus like this. There are some variations. Matthew, Mark, and John all place this incident here in the last few days before his crucifixion. Luke talks about an earlier event that happens in Luke chapter 7. Um, so that's just something to be aware of. The way the complaint is described is a little different between the versions. And in Matthew, it says that the disciples complained about what this woman had done. Mark is a little friendlier, perhaps, to the disciples. He just says, I think that bystanders had complaints about what she had done with the oil. And then in Luke, um, it's it's Simon the Pharisee, and that's whether Simon the Pharisee and Simon the leper are the same person. I don't have a strong opinion on. But then in John's account, he tells us, in fact, that it was Judas among the disciples who lodged the complaint against this woman. Um, so Jesus, what's his reaction to what they do? Their interpretation is they see this woman, she takes very costly oil and she anoints Jesus. And I think to them, it's a little irritating. It seems a little um, over the top, perhaps, is what they're thinking. And not only that, wasteful. That's the actual complaint. They say that it's wasteful because it's very costly. But what Jesus says about her is that she's done this anticipating his death. He says she's anointed him for his burial. So out of all of these people we read at the beginning of this chapter, she is the one. She's the one who intuitively understands and sees what Jesus is getting at. It's this woman. She intuitively realizes that his death is upon him, that he's going to have the need for a burial. She seemingly even realizes that he's going to die a criminal's death, and perhaps there won't be time to anoint his body for burial afterwards. So out of all the disciples, all of the friends there, it's this woman who seems to have been paying attention to what Jesus is saying and getting the point. Oh, we have a comment back here, Sister Walton.
Even though she wasn't apparently one of the disciples, she treated him like you would a king who was dying, anointing him with very expensive oil. And it goes back to the meek and the poor are in better shape than most of us.
We have another comment up here. Okay, so John 12, 1 through 3? Okay. All right, so in the account in John, the 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary therefore took a pound of expensive ointment made from pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Right, and in that account, it's Judas who complains. That's correct. And of course, that's another subtle difference between the way John tells it and Mark is that in one instance, it's talking about anointing the feet, and here it's his head. But here, Jesus, in this account here in Mark, Jesus is calling out that it's proper, it's appropriate. She's done it because she's anticipating his burial. And he makes this statement about the poor, which I don't think we should take as a reason not to give to the poor. Jesus says you'll always have the poor with you. His point is not there's always a time that taking care of the poor is something you can put off until a later date. His point is that of all things, what's about to happen to him, his death is preeminent above everything else. And this sort of goes back to Mark chapter 2 when he was asked about fasting and why his disciples don't fast. And he said, because the bridegroom is with them. So there's going to come a day when the bridegroom will be taken away. And he knows that that time is now. And so now it's appropriate for actions like this or for fasting. So Jesus gives this woman's action a great symbolic value. I think that's important for us to remember. He says that wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. So here Jesus is recognizing the significance about what's about to happen. that with his death and his resurrection, it's going to be something that's going to change the world. It's going to be something that people are going to talk about. They're going to proclaim what's happened. And what he's saying is, when this happens, you talk about this woman too, because she saw his purpose. She listened to him. She understood him. She saw him. And so Jesus praises her for this. Okay, and then at the very end, we have Judas now going to the chief priest to betray Jesus. So again, this book ends this story. They're looking to arrest him. They're looking to capture him in secret. Now Judas has gone off to conspire with them. What are his motivations? Maybe part of his motivations was what's just happened here, that he was upset about the cost of this. Perhaps part of it is he's coming to realize Jesus isn't the Messiah he wanted him to be. Jesus has been routinely now trying to teach them that he's come to Jerusalem as king, yes, but as a king who's about to be arrested and handed over to the authorities and executed. And so here we have Judas starts to put this betrayal into action. Now we get to the account of the Lord's Supper. And Mark states that this occurs on Passover. It says, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover? So here's, Jesus sort of sets up, here's one map, came out of my Bible. It's a thought of where this upper room traditionally is located, but somewhere within the city, Jesus has arranged, seemingly in secret, a place for them to meet. So we get to that here in verse 12. It says, in verse 13, he says, he sent two of his disciples and said to them, go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room furnished and ready. There prepare for us. And the disciples set out and went to the city and found it just as he had told them. And they prepared the Passover. All right, so Jesus has arranged for a place for he and his disciples to have this meal that Mark describes here as a Passover meal. So I think even though there is some, when you read John's account, John says that John doesn't talk about the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper. He talks about the foot washing only, but that presumably happens at the same time. John says this happens the day before Passover. The other accounts, Mark, Matthew, Luke, all place this on the Passover. I think either way, it's clear from the text in all of these that this meal that he's having with them is some sort of Passover meal. It's a celebration of the Passover. Of course, Jesus is going to give it a new meaning. He's going to redefine it. He's going to redefine it for his disciples and for all Christians from then on. But I think it's clear from the circumstances here, it is a kind of Passover meal. So it's eaten at night. That's when Passover meal would traditionally happen. Two, it's in the city. It's in Jerusalem, which is where a Passover meal had to take place. Normally, as we just said, they would go out to Bethany or outside the city to stay the night. But this night, they're in the city for this meal. But Jesus takes this Passover meal and he turns it into a meal that's centered on himself. So he takes the idea of the Passover and what he does with his disciples, and he joins them into something new. So I think it's worth thinking about just for a minute what a Passover meal is. Passover meal had been done since the times of the Exodus, right? It's a meal enacting out a story meant to recall God saving his people, right? It's meant to retell the story about how God saved Israel through the Exodus and entered into a new covenant. And then I'll suggest to you that I think Jesus is doing much the same thing. He's taking that story, but he's centering it on himself, and he's telling a new story about a new covenant, about how God is saving his people through himself, through his death, through giving up his body and his blood, and entering into a new covenant. I think also Jesus knows that his end is at hand, that his crucifixion is imminent. I think part of the reason he doesn't want this meal to be interrupted. This meal is too important, right? So this is a meal that has to happen. It has to occur. It has to take place. He has to have this time with his disciples. In fact, it's so important that we know from Paul's account of the Lord's Supper and Luke's account that Jesus instructed them to repeat this meal, right? And so it wasn't just something he wanted them to hear that night. It's something he wanted them to repeat until he comes again. So this meal is of utmost importance. All right, so with all that as a prefix to it, let's read what Mark tells us about it. All right, so starting in verse 17, it says, "And when it was evening, he came with the 12, and as they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus said, 'Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me.' And they began to be sorrowful and to say to him one after another, 'Is it I?' And he said to them, 'It is one of the 12. It's one who's dipping bread into the dish with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born.' And as they were eating, he took bread after blessing it, and he broke and he gave it to them. And he said, 'Take, this is my body.' And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks to them, they all drank of it. And he said to them, 'This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God.'" All right, so looking at the elements of this, first we have Jesus reclining with his disciples, and he tells them about his betrayal. By the way, I think reclining is something that was done at a Passover meal. And the gist of it is that free people recline, right? And so the Passover is a celebration of their freedom from the slavery in Egypt. And reclining is symbolic of they are God's free people. They are God's saved people. So here we see Jesus, and he's reclining. Of course, Jesus is bringing a new kind of freedom. But at the same time, he's announcing his betrayal. And he says it's from one of them. And so I think to me, that's something words can't adequately express. You just have to let it sink in. This is one of Jesus's 12. Judas had been with him from the beginning of the 12. He'd been with them through this whole 3-year period. He was one of the 12. But Jesus knows that he's been betrayed by one of his 12, who he loved. And then we get the symbolic acts. So Jesus gives them bread. It says, "And as they were sitting, he took bread, and after blessing it, he broke, and he gave it to them and said, 'Take it. This is my body.'" All right, so this meal then, it consists of both words and actions. And I think sometimes it's important to realize words aren't enough. There's some occasions in which words just aren't adequate to express. And I think for Jesus, this is one of them. There's power not just in his words, but in the actions. So if you think about what Jesus' actions are here with the bread and the cup, it's blessing the bread, breaking the bread, giving the bread. And with the cup, it's taking the cup, blessing the cup, and giving the cup. And then we have his words. It says about the cup, it says he took a cup, and when he gave thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many." So what is Jesus saying? To go back to the bread just for a minute, Jesus is taking the bread and he's identifying it with his own body. Part of this is prophetic still, because this hasn't happened, even though it's just shortly to happen. But here we have Jesus prophetically speaking that he's about to die, and he's giving his body as food to his disciples, I think with the intention that he's about to die, and it's through his death that his disciples would have life or sustenance. The bread is unleavened because this is a Passover meal. At Passover, they ate unleavened bread, and that's to remind them with about the haste and the urgency that they had to leave Israel. They didn't have time for the leavened bread. So the unleavened bread was necessary during the Exodus because of the haste and the urgency about it. Here, there's a haste and urgency about Jesus' death too. It's imminent. It's now we're hours away from his death coming. And then we get to Jesus' words about the cup. So Jesus, again, in a prophetic fashion, links the cup to his death. And more particularly, he links the cup to his blood. So there's common between, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but we have 4 accounts of the Lord's Supper in the Bible. We have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then 1 Corinthians from Paul. It's striking to me how similar the wording is in all of them. I think 1 Corinthians, probably the earliest one. But these are words that the first Christians remembered. They're words that they memorized. They're words that they repeated. They clung to. So the words that Jesus spoke to them this night were of primary importance to the first Christians. And obviously, I think that they should be to us. But here we have Jesus talking about a new covenant in his blood. That echoes back a little bit to the Exodus story too. If you recall, when Moses gave the people a covenant, it says in Exodus chapter 24, he sprinkled blood on them. It said, Moses took the blood and he threw it on the people, and he said, behold, the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words. So here Jesus is talking about a new covenant in his blood. So I think one last comment about just this Lord's Supper account. I think it's interesting that this account is marked with a meal. I just think it's a very human thing, and it's a God-given thing that we mark significant moments with significant meals. And sharing a meal, a festive meal even, it's something that binds people together. I remember last summer, we celebrated as a family a big family meal for my parents' 50th anniversary. Meals have a way of binding people together around significant events. And I think that's something we need to remember when we partake of this meal together, because this is something we continue to do every week, every Lord's Day. And I also think it's a reminder for us not to neglect the importance of hosting meals and hospitality, and the importance of sharing experiences around meals. It was important to Jesus, and I think it's something we can apply to ourselves as well. Scott?
Well, extending off those comments you just made, this is an observation I've shared before when we've studied the Gospels. It's not new to me. Someone taught me this, and it just struck me so much that I frequently bring it up. But if you put the accounts of the Last Supper together, but particularly if you look at John's account, it becomes apparent when they're all sitting around eating and they're trying to decide who it is that's going to betray him. And Jesus says, who I give the piece of bread to, and he has a conversation with Judas, and then he dips the bread and gives it to Judas. And in verse 30 of John 13, it tells us that Judas immediately left. So when you put that together with the account of Mark and Matthew, that when Jesus inaugurates the Lord's Supper here, Judas is not present anymore, because Judas is not part of him. And I think there's symbolism in that God's feast. I mean, you talk about the importance of us communing together as family and what that means. God's feast is open to all, but the people that he communes with are those that belong to him. And I just think it's a lot of symbolism that Judas, I think, left before this happened. And I think it's just something to think that, we're communing together, but we're communing with our Lord because we're part of him through this supper. And those that don't belong to him have no right to participate.
That's a great comment. Thank you. All right, so here we see that they're going to leave. They're going to exit this meal. And in verse 26, it says, they had sung a hymn, and they went out to the Mount of Olives. By the way, it's you don't know for certain, but it is possible that the hymns that they sang were Psalms 113 through 118. Those are what's known as the Hallel, and they were, I think, traditionally sang at a Passover meal. And so it is possible that when it says they sang a hymn, that's what they were singing. But at any rate, they did. They sang a hymn together to mark the end of this meal. And then they go out. It says they went out to the Mount of Olives. And then Jesus is going to make another prophetic statement here that I think is worth calling attention to. And so in verse 27, he tells them, in fact, even quoting Old Testament prophecy from Zechariah, he says, Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away, for it's written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I'm raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." And Peter said to him, "Even though they all fall away, I will not." And Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But he said emphatically, "If I must die with you, I will not deny you." And they all said the same. So here Jesus gives sort of a 2-part prophecy. One is that they're all going to be scattered. And then the second is very specific to Peter. He says, "Peter, you will deny me 3 times." And then after that, it's interesting because it's not just Peter, but it's all of them. So all of the 11, because at this point we know Judas is gone. But all 11 emphatically, it says they say emphatically, "If I must die with you, I'll do that, but I won't deny you." But nonetheless, Jesus has prophesied that they're all going to be scattered. They're all going to leave. And then we find Jesus in the garden. So the Garden of Gethsemane, we do know pretty much where it was, out on the east side of the city, outside the temple, across the Kidron Valley, and over near the Mount of Olives. And so they go out of the city for this event. And I think we know what happens here. Jesus takes this opportunity and he goes to pray. So we have in verse 32, it says, they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John. And then he began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." So it says, and going a little further, he fell on the ground and he prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but you will." And then he came and found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is indeed willing, but the flesh is weak." All right, so here we see this playing out. We see that Jesus, this story right here, this is raw. This is really raw with human emotion, I think. That's what I get out of it. When you look at the words it says about Jesus' emotions that he's feeling, it feels very, very, it's just very raw. You almost feel like you're looking in on this very intimate scene. And, it says, his soul is very sorrowful, even to death. He falls on the ground to pray. He's pleading with his father, invoking the name Abba, which is an intimate word for a father. Special name that a son would use for his father. "Remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but what you will." So here we have Jesus saying this triple prayer. He says it 3 times. Each time he goes back to his disciples, to Peter and James and John, and he finds them sleeping. But he says the prayer 3 times. And that's set apart as we go through the rest of the story by Peter's then going to deny him 3 times. So we have 3 times Jesus is going to place himself, his very life, in the hands of God and the Father, but ultimately say, "Your will, not mine." And then 3 times, Peter, his closest confidant, possibly his best friend, is going to deny that he even knows him. And so, to me, I just find this chapter this portion of chapter 14 very powerful. And then, of course, we know that the scene is going to end with a betrayal. We'll go ahead and read the rest of this, though. So starting in verse 39, it says, "Again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know how to answer him. And then he came a third time, and he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It's enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hand of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And then it says in verse 43, immediately, while Jesus was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12. Again, Mark points out this isn't just a betrayer. This is Judas, one of the 12. But he comes with a crowd that has swords and clubs. And they come from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard." And then he came and he went up to him at once, and he said, "Rabbi." And he kissed him. And they laid hands on him, and they seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." And they all left him and fled. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. All right, so this scene then ends with the betrayal that we know happens. Judas has found him. He's found him in the dark, found him outside the city. He's away from the protection of the crowds. This is just what the chief priests and the scribes said they needed. This was a chance for them to grab him with no one around, none of the crowds. It wouldn't cause a riot. They grab him in the night, alone, outside the city. We're told here that one disciple tries to fight. Mark, I think, maybe to Peter's pleasure, doesn't identify who it is, but we know from the other gospel accounts, or from John, I think that this is Peter. Mark just calls the man one of the bystanders. And then verse 50, it says they ran away. It's interesting throughout this passage, it's continually referring to the 11 now as his disciples. But in verse 50, it says they all left him and fled. So Mark doesn't call them his disciples in verse 50. And if you think about it, I don't know if that's intentional or not, but they're not being very disciple-like in this instance. Remember, when he appointed the 12, he gave them two purposes. One of those purposes was to be with him. And here, they spectacularly fail that, right? They were appointed to be apostles, to be with him, and yet they all fled. And then we get the verse about the young man who runs away. Almost a little comical item about, he was only wearing a linen cloth. I don't know if it was because of the late hour and that's what he wore out there. But it says, he lost that and he ran away naked. Sort of sounds a little similar to Joseph fleeing naked back in Genesis. I don't know, but some have speculated, I think, on who this person is. Mark doesn't identify him. Some people have even speculated, is this Mark himself? But I think who can say this is just an instance of they all left him. Jesus is alone. And so now here we have, he's alone, but now he's arrested and he's in custody and he's brought before the high priest. He's brought before the council. It's the great Sanhedrin, I believe. And so that would mean this is a council of 71 authorities, of whom the high priest is in the center. Brother Rob?
Before we get to that section, back in verse 31, and he spake more vehemently, "If I should die with thee, I will not deny thee anywise, Peter," okay? But it says right below that, "Likewise also did they all." So we jump on Peter a lot. And then the verse 40 or 50, they all forsook him. So it's like everybody said, "I ain't going, I'm going to stay with you," but everybody leaves. And then the part I always liked was in John, when Judas kisses him, he says, "Take him." Well, this Mark just says, "and they took him." Well, there was one minor problem. when he said, I am, and in John's account, they all fall back. So his power is still shown even in the day that he's going to die or the night before he's going to die the next day.
Yeah, that's a great comment. They all did say it, right? They all said, "We won't deny you, even to death." And then I think we have to remember, though, that in a way, Mark's talking about the power of Jesus too, but it's the power of Jesus as a prophet. Jesus had just said, "You're all going to forsake me," and they do. His prophecy is vindicated right here, kind of in real time, even though they all swore that wouldn't happen. So here we get, now Jesus is alone, but he's before the high priest. So we have Jesus. He's been betrayed by Judas, abandoned by the 10. Peter's followed along, but we know what Peter's going to do. Peter's going to deny he even knows Jesus. So Jesus here is utterly alone. What he's doing now from this point forward in the story, he has to do alone. No one else can help the Son of God give his life a ransom for the many. This is the moment when God's Son, when God's Messiah has to act alone. And so now we have this first hearing before Caiaphas, before the high priest. And I don't know that we have time to read through it all, but I'll suggest to you that this goes through 4 stages. And so the first part of this hearing, the questioning, they're grilling Jesus, it's very much all about the temple, the first half of this. In fact, up to nearly half of Mark's version of this, verses 57 through 61, there are charges about various things that they're claiming Jesus said about the temple. Mark refers to these as false witnesses. And so I think we see that here in verse 55. It says, they were seeking testimony about Jesus to put him to death, but they didn't find any. I'm sorry, verse 56. It says there were many false witnesses against him, but their testimony didn't agree. Like they were thwarted even in their offense, even in their attempt to sort of tarnish him with testimony. Their witnesses didn't agree. Instead, some of them stood up and saying, "We heard him say, 'I'll destroy this temple that's made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands.'" Yet even about this, it says they didn't agree. So the first part of this trial is all seemingly about statements that Jesus was said to have made about the temple. Now this is interesting because Jesus did say quite a few things about the temple. In fact, we just talked last week in Mark 13. Jesus gave a very clear prophecy about the temple. He said the stones will not be left standing on each other. But I think, how do we reconcile the fact that Mark says these were false? Well, one, Jesus didn't claim that he would destroy the temple himself. So we don't get that, in fact, in any of the gospel accounts. Jesus issued a prophecy or a judgment from God, but he didn't claim that he would, in fact, himself destroy the temple. And then Mark has no mention of Jesus claiming he would build the temple back in 3 days. That does sound very similar to John 2:19. But John tells us that Jesus was talking about his body. And in fact, I think even there, Jesus doesn't talk about himself rebuilding it. He says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days it will be rebuilt." Second gets to the question of messiahship. So then we get to Caiaphas's question here. He says, "What do you have to say about these charges about the temple?" And Jesus says nothing. So we're told that Jesus doesn't respond to the charges about the temple. But here in verse 61, we have Caiaphas, and he says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Now, from all the commentaries I've looked at, I understand in the original Greek it says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Question mark. It's a statement with a question mark at the end. And in fact, I think we see a little bit of that in Matthew's account, because in Matthew, Jesus says, "Well, you've said it." He says, "You have said it." Here, Jesus responds and he says, "I am." But here we have, Mark is centered around 2 confessions about Jesus. The first is Peter, right in the middle of Mark's story. Peter gives his confession that Jesus is the Messiah. And here at the climax of the whole story, we have Israel's high priest himself making that statement. It's a statement in the form of the question, but the words are actually nearly identical to what Peter said when he confessed. You are the Christ, the Son of the Blessed, the Son of the God, the Son of God. And so here we have Israel's high priest stating that Jesus is the Messiah. And at this point, Jesus says, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And so that's part 3 of what happens here, Jesus' answer. So Jesus now, while he was silent before, he answers this statement question in the affirmative. He says yes. And then he also predicts that there's going to be a vindication. He says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. And I think what he's saying to Caiaphas here is, he's not saying you're going to find out at the end of the world. What he's saying is, Caiaphas, you're going to witness this. You're going to witness these strange events that are going to happen after the crucifixion. You're going to witness the rise of a group of my disciples who are going to claim that I've risen from the dead. You're going to witness the events that are going to lead toward the ultimate destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And you're ultimately going to witness the end of the temple, the end of the high priesthood, the end of the entire sacrificial system. So Jesus makes this statement back to Israel's high priest, who then takes it as a guilty plea. So we see in verse 65 or verse 64, he says, 63, what further witnesses do we need? He says, you've heard this blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death, and some began to spit on him and to cover his face and to strike him, saying, prophesy. And the guards received him with blows. All right, so the high priest takes this as a confession. He charges him with blasphemy. They seemingly charge him with being a false prophet too, because they're beating him and telling him to prophesy. I find the timing of all this interesting. It says, while they're beating him and spitting on him and striking him and telling him to prophesy, this is when we have Peter's denial. So as this is happening, we have Peter denying for the 3rd time. And in verse 68 it says, I neither know nor understand what you mean. And he went out of the gateway, and the rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him and began to say to the bystanders, this man is one of them. But he denied it again. In verse 71, but he began to invoke a curse on himself and swear, I don't know this man whom you speak. And immediately the rooster crowed a 2nd time. And Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. Then he broke down and wept. So here, while they're beating him and shouting to prophesy, his prophecy is actually being fulfilled at the same time. Peter has denied him. We have one comment here, and then I think we're going to have to end. I think that's a great point. I agree. And just one more comment on Peter's denial before we end. I think it's in John's account. It says as Peter denied him the 3rd time, it says Jesus looked at him. And so to me, that sort of indicates they were in close enough proximity that Jesus could hear Peter denying that he even knew him, because he looked at him on the 3rd time. And so I think if you just think about how difficult that must be for Jesus to experience. All right, I want to thank everyone for their participation. This was my last class, so I will not be here next week to finish off the class. But Cassidy Eves has offered to do that, so he'll do